Hey everyone, this is chapter 4 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Chapter 4 is titled, quote, scientific, end quote, Marxism. Following all the excitement they encountered in Munich, the two friends were yearning for calm and keen to find their bearings again. They stayed at the Oranian guest house in the West End for several weeks, and then bought a house in nearby Kronberg im Taunus. They had borrowed most of the requisite funds from Pollock's parents and his brother Hans, who was now a co-signatory in the family business. In addition, they sold the works of Franz Marc, Paul Klee, and Marc Chagall they had acquired in Munich at a profit. The return is likely to have been relatively modest, but at least it gave them the sense that they were not entirely dependent on family money, given that for them it embodied oppression and exploitation. While their new domicile allowed them to revive the Ile Heureuse in the event, Mesdames Richer only moved in with them in the winter of 1921 because Pollock and Horkheimer decided to spend the summer semester of 1920 and the winter semester of 1920-21 at Freiburg University, where Horkheimer was to attend the lectures of the great phenomenologist Edmund Husserl. The seminar of Husserl's assistant Heidegger, which they also attended, evidently made no lasting impression on Pollock, and who was enrolled in the legal and political studies faculty. Apart from occasional going to Heidegger's seminar and attending Husserl's lectures, he studied political economy with Karl Diehl and Robert Liefman. Back in Frankfurt, they were finally able to establish their triple alliance with Mesdames. This constellation differed from that in London, however, since Mesdames, in contrast to Neumeier, was unambiguously Horkheimer's partner, while Pollock was best friends with both of them. Writing to her in April 1921, when she was still in Stuttgart, he called her, quote, the most enviable of women, end quote, enviable because she was in a relationship with his best friend. Even so, he signed the letter, quote, yours, parenthesis, in part, and parenthesis, F, end quote. That Pollock loved her, even though a sexual relationship between them was inconceivable, is also demonstrated by another letter from this time, which he signed, quote, yours with Chris's, Friedrich, end quote. Next to the misspelt word Chris's, a combination of greetings and kisses, he scribbled in pencil, quote, Freud, question mark, end quote. This was not a conventional ménage à trois then. Moreover, while Mesdames henceforth played an integral role in Pollock and Horkheimer's life, Mesdames was neither admitted to their covenant nor party to the decision-making process when it came to the realization of its ideals. Pollock enthusiastically embraced his studies in economics, but found the introductory lectures by the classical economist Paul Arndt rather disappointing. Franz Oppenheimer and Adolf Weber, despite neither of them being well versed in Marxist theory, were more to his liking. Oppenheimer, an impassioned Zionist, was an expert in economic theory, whose broad knowledge and grasp of historical context attracted the brightest students. Oppenheimer's portfolio included lectures on the history of socialism. Two of his assistants later became collaborators in the context of the Institute of Social Research. The Marxist theoretician Fritz Sternberg. I have a piece about Fritz Sternberg's conception of the USSR on this channel, by Marcel van der Linden. Anyway, back to the text. And the psychologist Kurt Goldstein, Horkheimer's aforementioned school friend Adolf Loewe, who would later work closely with the Institute, and the theologian Paul Tillich, one of Pollock's closest friends in the United States, had studied with Oppenheimer when he was still in Berlin. Beginning in 1922, one Theodor Wiesengrund was also among his students. That would be Adorno. As a, quote, avowed theoretician and universalist, end quote, Oppenheimer cut a distinct figure among his colleagues. The University of Frankfurt grew out of the Senckenberg Institutes and the city's commercial academy, and it was still, quote, strongly oriented toward the training of practical commercial skills, end quote, as Oppenheimer recalled in his memoirs. Indeed, a large part of the student body, quote, intended to enter a commercial or some other practical profession as soon as they graduate, end quote. Prima facie, even Pollock and Horkheimer matched this profile, yet they were only keeping up appearances to assuage their parents. Not that either of them knew what they wanted to do after graduation. Occasionally, Pollock contemplated taking the easy path his father had paved for him after all. Even so, they certainly did not organize their studies in a way that would have equipped them with the practical skills required to go straight into the private sector after graduation. In contrast to Oppenheimer, Adolf Weber, parenthesis, not to be confused with the sociologist Alfred Weber, end parenthesis, who soon left Frankfurt again, was an adherent of economic liberalism and unambiguous opponent of socialism. His vantage was frequently shaped by Max Weber's sociology, however, and he was interested in welfare issues, the social problems of large urban centers, and the history of labor relations. Pollock's main reservations regarding Weber was that he proposed no remedies for the problems he identified. In this respect, he found the Marxist authors, whose work he had begun to read in Munich, much more compelling. Yet Marx, let alone Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg, were not taught at the University of Frankfurt. In the winter semester of 1921/22, a new academic popped up in the course register who became an important point of reference for Pollock. Siegfried Budge, a nephew of one of the Jewish patrons of the university, Henry Budge. He had just completed his postdoctoral qualification under Oppenheimer's supervision and offered 2 tutorials on Marx and one on the classical economist David Ricardo. His core specialism was monetary theory from Turgot to Ricardo and Marx, and Pollock became his star student. It was not long before the plan emerged for Pollock to write a doctoral thesis on Marx's concept of money under Budge's supervision. This project led Pollock into the inner sanctum of political economy. Alongside Oppenheimer's works and those of Joseph Schumpeter, he closely studied Rathenau's lecture on production policy of October 1920, the first volume of Bawerk's Kapital und Kapitalzins, parenthesis, Capital and Interest, first published in 1884, end parenthesis, the first volume of Karl Diehl's Theoretische Nationalökonomie, parenthesis, Theoretical Economics, 1916, end parenthesis, Friedrich Julius Neumann's important essay Wirtschaftliche Gesetze nach früherer und jetziger Auffassung, or The Past and Present Understanding of Economic Laws. Heinrich Dietzel's classic Theoretische Sozialökonomik, parenthesis, Theoretical Socioeconomics, 1895, end parenthesis. And he kept coming back to Marx's Capital. In addition, he read the leading Marxists of the age, Karl Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Rudolf Hilferding, and Lenin. On the 15th of March 1923, Fritz, end quote, Pollock, was able to submit his thesis, Zur Geldtheorie von Karl Marx, parenthesis, on Karl Marx's monetary theory, end parenthesis, to the examination board of the Economics and Social Sciences faculty. At the same time, Horkheimer completed his thesis, Zur Antinomie der teleologischen Urteilskraft, parenthesis, the anatomy of teleological judgment, end parenthesis, under the supervision of the neo-Kantian philosopher Hans Cornelius. They both passed with top marks, parenthesis, summa cum laude, end parenthesis. Pollock had originally intended to publish his thesis, but another author working on a closely related topic had managed to bring his book out first, and Pollock was forced to abandon his plan. Consequently, the typescript gathered dust in the university library and made no discernible impact. It does, however, offer an interesting indication of his scholarly preoccupations in the early 1920s and helps position him within the Weimar era left. In his thesis, Pollock did more than offer a detailed reconstruction of the concept of money Marx developed in Capital and the Grundrisse. He engaged in the critique of ideology, a relatively new approach pioneered at the time by Isaac Rubin, Georg Lukács, and Evgeny Pashukanis in writings not yet known to Pollock. Like them, Pollock sought to recover the critical potential of Marx's theory that had been submerged by social democratic dogmatism, de-emphasizing the theories of revolution and class that were at the center of orthodox Marxism. Pollock, Lukács, Rubin, and Pashukanis placed Marx's concepts of ideology, reification, and fetishism center stage. In light of the failed revolutions of 1918-1919, mechanisms of ideological delusion were an obvious focal point. Evidently, world revolution was not, as orthodox Marxism claimed, the necessary and inevitable product of the laws of history. That the revolution had failed, even though not only intellectuals but sections of the proletariat too had supported it, needed to be explained, and the critique of ideology in Marx's vein had the potential to do just that. As Marx explained in the first volume of Capital, capitalism was a mode of production that concealed its true character. The workers were indeed exploited, but the ideological mechanism of commodity fetishism prevented them from appreciating this. As early as 1902 in What is to be Done, written in exile in Munich, Lenin had discussed why spontaneous labor movements invariably led to no more than, quote, mere trade unionism, end quote. And trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie, end quote. This assumption led Lenin to believe that communist parties needed to act as an avant-garde and assert the interests of the proletariat, if need be, in ways few proletarians would immediately understand or condone. Yet the anticipated world revolution had failed to materialize, forcing the regime and the nascent Soviet Union to resort to increasingly counterintuitive and disconcerting measures to defend the revolution. The KPD, Communist Party of Germany, controlled ever more closely by Moscow, held the SPD responsible for the failure of the revolution, as they saw the Social Democrats had betrayed the workers. Conversely, intellectuals critical of Moscow increasingly questioned Lenin's revolutionary theory. Focusing on epistemological issues, Pollock doubtlessly belonged to the second group. The task of the scholar, he argued in his thesis, was to identify that which the seemingly obvious in fact covered up. For example, in the case of money, what is reflected not, quote, material realia, end quote, as the economist Walter Lotz, whose lectures Pollock had attended in Munich, claimed, but a social relationship. The distinction between essence and appearance also underpinned Pollock's materialist critique of the legal system. The exploitation of labor was, quote, concealed by bourgeois legal norms, implying that human beings interact as free and independent subjects, while obscuring the relations of independence in the process of production, end quote. Real-life individuals only ever witness various forms of competition, and one could not possibly gain any genuine, quote, insights into the structure of the social reproduction process, end quote, simply by describing the legal forms that facilitated capitalist exploitation on their own terms. Individuals only ever judge the daily cut and thrust in terms of the categories right and wrong. Individual conduct under the condition of competition was thus reduced to a moral issue, making it impossible to appreciate the significance of the overarching framework structuring social relations. The key to understanding society lay not in the legal and moral assessment of the consequences of competition, but in the analysis of its economic foundations. Pollock sought to implement this agenda in two ways. First, by reconstructing Marx's theory of capitalism, and secondly, with a critique of contemporaneous scholars of political economy. Pollock rejected the prevalent uncritical characterization of money as simply a neutral means of payment. It was in fact an expression of systematic exploitation, he insisted. To be sure, exploitation, too, is a moral category, but Pollock sought to characterize it in, quote, scientific, end quote, terms. The fundamental principle of capitalist exploitation, Pollock explained, was that workers provided more labor than absolutely necessary indirectly robbing the workers of their part of their lifespan. In theory, workers' wages covered all they needed to sustain themselves, yet this did not change the fact that they produced more goods than they would need to turn out in order to cover their own needs. In short, the workers were constantly rendering surplus labor that exclusively benefited the capitalist. A fictitious pre-capitalist model illustrates what for Pollock was the crux of the matter. We spend 4 hours a day growing turnips and potatoes, but do not farm the large meadow next to the field because we are easily able to make ends meet with the harvest we have. Then someone convinces us not to while away half the day and instead use all our assets to maximize our turnip and potato harvest. We now work 8 hours a day and harvest twice as many vegetables. Since our own consumption has not increased, we barter the surplus to obtain, say, a new table or a beautiful vase. Yet then, our small enterprise confronts its first crisis, because the farmer next door is willing to barter more turnips for a beautiful vase. The turnips it has taken so much effort to grow now perish because no one wants them. For the length of a season, we have wasted 4 hours a day for absolutely nothing, when we could have spent that time reading a good book, or as Adorno later put it, quote, lying on the water and looking peacefully at the sky, end quote. Footnote. The German term Wissenschaft encompasses both the STEM disciplines and the arts and humanities, hence ethnomusicologists and historians of the medieval book are considered, quote, scientists in the, quote, in the same way as nuclear physicists or evolutionary biologists, which obviously does not correspond to standard Anglophone usage. In the arts and humanities, it is therefore generally more appropriate to translate the term as scholarship. The case of, quote, scientific, end quote, Marxism is more complex, however, insofar as Marxists consciously adopt the label scientific precisely to indicate, as they saw it, Marxism was no less an exact and reliable science than any of the STEM subjects. Parenthesis, how exact and reliable they themselves really are is, of course, another matter altogether, end parenthesis. A similar conceit presumably underpins the term social sciences. The inverted commas, quote, scientific, end quote, Marxism, are designed to mediate between this conceit and what tends to be familiar to Anglophone readers. End footnote. That was an earlier footnote. In this simplistic, purely illustrative example, no great harm is done. We can simply go back to only working 4 hours a day and producing no more than we need ourselves. In a world that is profoundly shaped by a complex division of labor, and in which few people own their own field or factory, the problem becomes altogether more serious. Where most are forced to make a living by working for others, those for whom they work dictate the conditions. Within the constraints of the law, the capitalist sets the working hours and ensures that the workers produce a sufficient surplus during those hours. In order to guarantee that he gets his money's worth from the labor he buys, the capitalist imposes a regime of obedience and discipline. The workers' fortunes, meanwhile, may fluctuate, but ultimately their status is always precarious, and they constantly face the threat of poverty and destitution should they not be productive enough. All they can do is join forces with their peers to try and attain better working conditions. To this end, they can pursue one of two options. They can join the revolutionary struggle and seek to subvert the very principle of wage labor and take issue with the private ownership of the means of production, parenthesis, factories, land, etc., end parenthesis, or they can support a reformist approach that does not question that principle and instead reflects moral concerns about insufficient wages and excessive working hours. Arguing from a scholarly point of view, and without drawing any immediate political conclusions from his analysis, Pollock inclined towards the revolutionary response. As Pollock saw it, the reformist approach was based on a fundamental fallacy. What was exploitative was not the fact that wages were too low, but the fact that capitalism was predicated, as a matter of principle, on the extraction of surplus labor, i.e., on workers rendering more labor than was, quote, objectively necessary, that was, quote, objectively, end quote, necessary to sustain workers. The capitalists, as the sole owners of the means of production, claimed to be engaging in a fair exchange when in fact they were stealing the workers' time. In short, when it came to wage labor, the reformists failed to discern the distinction between essence and appearance. In purely formal terms, the employment contract did seem to codify a fair exchange. Paid for their labor, workers were able to spend their wages as they saw fit. Yet on closer inspection, it transpires that for the workers, the exchange was only ever a zero-sum game. While the capitalists profited from the surplus labor, wages never did more than replenish what the workers needed to sustain themselves. Just how much that was depended on the state of the class struggle. Consequently, the workers would never be able to rise above their inferior position and always continued to be dependent on the capitalist unless they were able to take control of the means of production. The class struggle, as the trade unions and reformist social democrats pursued it, primarily as a matter of appropriate wage levels, was of little interest to Pollock. On the one hand, it reminded Pollock of the wage bargaining Pollock had encountered in the hated family business. On the other, Pollock's big-picture identification with the proletariat did not stretch this far. This did not register with him as a lack of empathy. For him, it was simply a mark of the radicality of his position. Ultimately, Pollock's fundamental question was how a barter economy could systematically produce inequality, and Pollock saw the key to answering it in Marx's concept of money. The entire extensive and intricate process of commodity exchange, Pollock argued, transpired through money in the form of wages and payments for machines, factories, storage facilities, and commodities. Not that Pollock was in any way inclined to acknowledge the demonization of money as a valid critique of capitalism. In specific functioning capitalism, quote, already presupposes the capital relation, end quote. The systematic state-driven expropriation of small leaseholders in early modern England was a case in point. It proletarianized the former leaseholders and helped precipitate the creation of two clearly distinguishable classes, those who own the means of production and the proletarians who own nothing but their labor. Above both stood the state. It ensured that the capital relation was maintained. Pollock was one of the first explicitly to make the point that the emergence of money could not be explained simply in terms of an evolving barter economy and system of payment in kind. It was intrinsically dependent on what Marx called, quote, state compulsion, end quote. Whoever is not willing to talk about the state should also keep quiet about money. In his discussion of international money transfers, Pollock again pointed to the fact that the value of currency depended on state coercion. Quote, the state's power to render relatively, quote, worthless, end quote, objects legally valid tender to, end quote, he noted, quote, ceases at its borders, end quote. The state can determine what qualifies as money only for the territory it controls. Pollock thus rejected liberal theories maintaining that money had simply emerged as a rational means of exchange, and that the state merely functioned as the proverbial night watchman who guaranteed that all parties stuck to the rules supposedly agreed in some mythical primeval past. Pollock might have identified this notion of a social contract developed by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century at the beginning of the bourgeois age as a necessary illusion indispensable to the capitalist order, i.e., a form of bourgeois ideology. Yet this is not a line of argument Pollock developed. The relish with which he mocked the bourgeois economists who ignored all relations of force and compulsion in the economic sphere to paint a picture of harmony and consensus demonstrates how critical he had become of conventional political economy. Pollock also touched on crisis theory in his thesis, on issues that continued to preoccupy him for decades. Following Marx, Pollock defined capitalist crises in terms of the existence of a, quote, abundance of commodities that no one wants to buy, end quote. Ordinarily, it then seemed as though the crisis were caused by a lack of disposable funds. Consequently, the state responded by printing more money, which in turn led to inflation. It should be borne in mind that Pollock wrote his thesis against the backdrop of steadily mounting inflationary pressures in Germany and completed it just as the hyperinflation of 1923 began to gather pace. Sounding more like an advisor than a critic of the government, Pollock pointed to the wrong-headedness of printing ever more unsupported paper money. It would be much better to bring in a, quote, boatload of gold, end quote, because what was lacking was not tender per se, but sufficient means of payment, parenthesis, in a specific Marxian sense of the term, end parenthesis. Pollock's prescription was not far removed from the measures eventually taken to bring the crisis under control. Alongside the securing of a range of international agreements that allowed the government to attract substantial American loans, it was the introduction of the Reichsmark, which was pegged to the gold standard, that temporarily stabilized the situation, paving the way for the so-called Golden Twenties, even if the years of relative stability from 1924 to 1928 no longer look all that golden with the benefit of hindsight. Other topics discussed by Pollock in his thesis included the nexus between the amount of money in circulation and the prices of commodities, the velocity of money, and the, quote, fate of money that is surplus to requirement in the sphere of circulation, end quote. Pollock's principal achievement, however, lay in his reconstruction of Marx's theory of money and value and the methodological and epistemological questions they raised. Pollock's study created a crucial foundation for the Marx reception of the Frankfurt School and in the Institute of Social Research. Pollock was rightly considered the in-house expert for the critique of political economy. When Hans-Georg Backhaus, who studied at the Institute in Frankfurt in the 1960s, and one day, to his great surprise, found a first edition of Marx's Capital in the library of his halls of residence, had questions about Marx's theory of value, Horkheimer and Adorno promptly sent Hans-Georg Backhaus to Friedrich Pollock as the obvious expert in such matters. Given that it was not published, the scholarly reception of Pollock's thesis was virtually non-existent. It may well have been known in Marxist and communist circles, however. One way or another, Pollock soon enjoyed a reputation as being intimately familiar with Marxist thought. In his first year at Frankfurt, Pollock had befriended his fellow student Felix Jose Weil, who lived from 1898 to 1975. In parentheses, the son of German-Jewish wheat trader Hermann Weil, whose business in Buenos Aires made him a millionaire several times over. His father had sent him to Frankfurt when he was 9 to ensure that he received a solid education and benefited from sound commercial training. Having gained the requisite qualification to enter higher education, Felix Weil, who, as an Argentine citizen, was not called up during the war, had gone straight on to study political economy. The revolutionary turmoil of 1918-1919 also affected Frankfurt, and as an enthusiastic supporter of the insurgents, Felix Weil found himself, though more by accident than by design, defending one of their positions with a weapon in his hand. In the summer semester of 1919, following the failure of the revolution, Weil switched to the University of Tübingen to study with the Marxist Robert Wilbrandt, who eventually suggested he develop one of his seminar papers into a doctoral thesis. Alas, his political record got in the way of this plan when, in October 1919, Weil was temporarily detained and then expelled from the province of Württemberg, where Tübingen was located, end parentheses. He returned to Frankfurt, where he did then embark on a doctorate. His thesis, Sozialisierung, Versuch einer begrifflichen Grundlegung nebst einer Kritik der Sozialisierungspläne, parentheses, socialization towards a conceptual foundation for and critique of the socialization plans, end parentheses, supervised by Adolf Weber, was eventually published in its series edited by the ultra-left communist theoretician and activist Karl Korsch. During the November Revolution, the Council of People's Commissioners, dominated by the Social Democrats, had appointed a socialization commission chaired by Karl Kautsky and tasked with the nationalization of certain industries. As well as Weil's former teacher, Wilbrandt, it assembled some of the most prominent economists of the age, including Joseph Schumpeter, Emil Lederer, Max Weber, and Rudolf Hilferding to debate relevant ways and means. Politicians and industrialists, including Walter Rathenau, weighed in on the debate, as did the far right, which supported certain forms of nationalization. Weil was the first to review and systematize the debate and offer a clear outline of the diverging concepts. Weil had noticed Pollock and Horkheimer because they were the only students in the seminars who openly articulated socialist positions. The three of them became friends, went on to spend a great deal of time in each other's company, and started making plans together. Weil maintained relations to various prominent Marxist intellectuals and readily introduced Pollock to them. It is unclear whether Pollock knew that Weil had started working as an informer, codenamed Lucio or Beatus Lucio, for the Communist International in Buenos Aires in 1921, and submitted numerous reports on the Argentinian left that went straight to Lenin's right-hand man, Grigory Zinoviev. Not that it would have drawn his friendship with Weil into question if he had known. Far from it, Pollock had big plans, and Weil's connections and his financial resources were most welcome. Weil had been contemplating the possibility of losing his father's money and the funds he had inherited from his mother, who died young, to create a Marxist institute to explore and promote socialism on a scholarly basis and unconstrained by party political dogmatism. With the input of Kurt Albert Gerlach, a professor of economics with anarchist leanings and former member of the Independent Socialists who had just moved from Aachen to Frankfurt, the plan was now revived. Unclear about how exactly to go about implementing it, the initial brainstorming took place on a park bench close to Pollock and Horkheimer's house in Kronberg. What then really set the process in motion were the plans of Karl Korsch, who held a precarious position at the University of Jena at the time, to convene a conference on, quote, scientific, end quote, Marxism. Pollock and Weil enthusiastically welcomed Korsch's initiative, envisaging the conference as their institute's inaugural event. The friends turned to Hermann Weil, who was seriously ill and returned to Frankfurt, asking him to fund both the conference and their planned institute, for which Pollock suggested the innocuous name Institute of Social Research. Hermann Weil had for some time been concerned about the growing virulence of anti-Semitism in Germany, and thus they included research on anti-Semitism in the prospective institute's mission statement. That's very interesting. Motivated not least by the hope that his patronage might earn him an honorary doctorate from Frankfurt University, Hermann Weil agreed to fund the construction of the institute building and provide an annual subsidy of 120,000 Reichsmarks, a modest amount by his standards, In addition, Hermann Weil promised to endow a chair for social philosophy at the university to be held ex officio by the institute's director, thus creating a firm link between the institute and the university. On the 1st of November 1922, Felix Weil and Friedrich Pollock established the Society of Social Research. Hermann Weil was the notional chair, Felix Weil his deputy. Gerlach unexpectedly died of diabetes before he could take up the position of academic director. The acclaimed Engels biographer Gustav Meyer, who held a personal chair in the history of democracy and socialism in Berlin, proved too much of a diva and presumably never seriously contemplated giving up the position he had finally secured in Berlin after the war. In the end, Karl Grünberg, who was appointed as the Institute's first director. He previously held the chair in political economy at the University of Vienna, edited the Archiv für die Geschichte des Sozialismus und der Arbeiterbewegung, Archive for the History of Socialism and the Labor Movement, generally known simply as Grünberg's Archiv. end parenthesis. And it was well respected in Marxist circles. Karl Grünberg was known as a congenial scholar primarily interested in historical and sociological issues rather than Marxist theory. An avowed Marxist, he kept his distance from the Communist Party and seemed the ideal director for a pluralist and non-dogmatic Marxist institute. The institute would have its own building and be academically independent, its affiliation with the university notwithstanding. Arthur Oppenheimer, a notary and business associate of Hermann Weyl, led the negotiations with the university. There was, after all, a substantial amount of money and the endowment of an externally funded chair at stake. There were politically motivated reservations on the part of the university, but the negotiations were successfully completed all the same. On the 3rd of February 1923, the institute was officially established. Construction work on its purpose-built premises on Victoria Alley, close to the university, began a month later. In the meantime, preparations for an 8-day conference directed by Korsch and Weyl, the first Marxist study week, which took place in May 1923, were rapidly advancing. 20 young communists gathered in a station hotel in Geraburg, Thuringia, to discuss the ongoing social crisis in the Weimar Republic and a range of research questions and methodological issues relating to, quote, scientific, end quote, Marxism. Korsch and Weyl had asked Richard Zorga, Gerlach's former assistant and member of the Communist Party of Germany, to select the participants. Illustrious figures such as Georg Lukács, Karl August Wittfogel, Konstantin Zetkin, the son of veteran communist activist Clara Zetkin, an erstwhile lover of Rosa Luxemburg, accepted his invitation. Felix Weil's wife, Ketta Weil, née Bachert, also took part. The conference focused on 3 main themes. Eduard Alexander, a lawyer who originally came from the Ruhr region and was at the time a municipal KPD deputy in Berlin, he was later elected to the Reichstag, ran the first section on ways of dealing with the current crisis, a topic Pollock had just treated in his thesis. Korsch and Lukács then led the discussion on Marxist methodology. Here too, Pollock was able to make a valuable contribution. The final section on organizational aspects of Marxist research was directed by the Hungarian philosopher and communist Béla Fogarasi. The participants all considered the conference a great success, with one exception. Weil lamented that only intellectuals had taken part and that the gathering had rendered no practical results. Weil failed to appreciate what the conference had in fact achieved. Communist intellectuals, most of them party members, had gathered informally, unconstrained by party discipline, to discuss essential Marxist concerns. That Pollock and Weil took part, despite neither being nor intending to become party members, indicates just how fundamentally the gathering differed from the leftist party congresses and propaganda events. This was just the undogmatic, free-spirited approach to which Weil and Pollock wanted to shape the Institute. The public inauguration ceremony took place on the 22nd of June 1924. In his address, Karl Grünberg confirmed that the Institute would be devoted above all to research. Teaching, by contrast, would be no more than an indulgence. Quote, after the ceremony, while the last guests were still wandering around the building, end quote. Weil later recalled, quote, Pollock and I walked up to the Institute's notice board and attached the announcements of our first course, end quote. Quote, Imperialism, run by Dr. Felix Weil, end quote. The lead instructor was the aforementioned Fritz Sternberg, a member of the Zionist Labor Party, Paula Zion, who had worked as Franz Oppenheimer's assistant for 3 years before leaving the academy after a dispute with his mentor. Fritz Sternberg was an unaffiliated Marxist intellectual and later joined the German Socialist Workers' Party, SAPD, that split from the SPD in 1931 and called for a united front with the communists to combat fascism. Fritz Sternberg fled Germany in March 1933, supporting resistance activities against the Nazis, first from Czechoslovakia and then from Switzerland. In 1939, Sternberg was able to move to the USA, where he regularly contributed to the Institute's Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, parenthesis, studies in philosophy and social science, end parenthesis. In the 1920s, Sternberg was originally involved in the Institute's work and made quite an impression on the students. Quote, he was an unusually fat Jewish man with a mop of black curls, and he had really beautiful eyes, end quote. Nellie Held, one of the Institute's students at the time, who regularly took part in Pollock's seminar, later recalled. Quote, Fritz Sternberg was a big fan of Rosa Luxemburg, whom Lenin and the party more generally had criticized for some of her theories. ... Fritz Sternberg wrote a book, Imperialism, which I obviously read, end quote. Fritz Sternberg's evolving conceptualization of imperialism, eventually presented in this book published in 1926 by Malik in Berlin, caused quite a stir among Marxists, and Weil ensured that it was discussed early on at the Institute. The completion of his doctorate notwithstanding, Weil never really settled into academic life, not least because of Weil's father's illness. Weil vacillated between the family business and leftist patronage. Weil frequently traveled to Argentina, which is the focal point of his commercial activities, but his political activities were increasingly centered on Berlin. Weil was strongly invested in the reorganization of the Malik publishing house under the commercial auspices of Julian Gumpertz, who later completed his doctorate under Pollock's supervision and worked for Pollock at the Institute. The publisher introduced the likes of Upton Sinclair, Leo Tolstoy, Maxim Gorky to the German public. Weil also generously supported George Grosz and other avant-garde artists. God, I love George Grosz. I don't really know much about art, but I love him. Gruenberg and Pollock, who was concerned with the Institute's administration, were perfectly happy when Weil soon took an increasingly hands-off approach to its day-to-day running, his enthusiasm for the Institute notwithstanding. This made it easier to shape the Institute as they saw fit. In his memoirs, Weil later took issue with the contention that he had supported the Institute only financially, but not participated directly in its work. Yet the sources show just that. Weil stayed in touch but systematically wound down his active involvement, although Weil certainly continued to be consulted on crucial decisions. Pollock took charge of the administration, and Gruenberg determined the academic profile. The reliability of Weil's account is doubtful then, which means that the following anecdote relating to the Institute's inauguration, too, needs to be taken, at the very least, with a pinch of salt. According to Weil, Pollock asked him whether they should, quote, each inaugurate our offices too. I have a bottle of sparkling wine in my coat just in case, end quote. Weil then looked at his watch, and seeing that it was only noon, insisted that, quote, one inaugurates an office by working in it, end quote. Quote, fine by me, end quote, Pollock had answered, and thus the Institute's first working day began. Weil had just written his first official letter, expressing his gratitude to Erich Wende, an enormously helpful administrative official of the Prussian Ministry of Education, when there was a knock at his door. Quote, 3 young men entered and introduced themselves. One of them was a political studies student, the other 2 were metal workers. They wanted to know how the admission to our tutorials and seminars worked, end quote. The first seminars offered by Karl Gruenberg, Henrik Grossmann, and Karl Korsch were exceptionally well attended. Quote, when I think back to the Institute's seminars between 1924 and 1929, end quote, Weil later reminisced, quote, I remember one thing above all, the crowds. Far more students and workers wanted to attend than we were able to accommodate. They even came in droves from abroad. I still remember various Americans, and especially an Indian, Mana Bendra Nath Roy, I just always see M.A. Roy, who later played a role in the Communist Party of his country, end quote. Pollock, too, was involved in teaching. Pollock's first Institute internal seminar dealt with the, quote, problem of worker and salaried employees' leisure time, end quote. Yet Pollock's main role was managerial. Teaching may have featured more prominently than Grunberg had envisioned, but research was nevertheless at the heart of the Institute's work. To this end, not only offices, but a reading room and an excellent library, too, were required. In close coordination with Grunberg, Pollock, and Weil, Rosa Schlesinger, who had married Karl August Wittfogel in 1921, built up a substantial library that comprised 42,000 books and subscriptions to 412 journals, 123 of them from abroad, and 40 newspapers. The library was run by a man called Huber, as well as Schlesinger and Richard Zorga's wife, Christiana, also worked in the library, until the couple, both of whom were Soviet spies, disappeared in October 1924, as did Siegfried Krakauer's future wife, Lily Ehrenreich, Clara Machauer, and one Mrs. Weiser. That the employees in the library, except for the director, were all women, while the academic staff consisted entirely of men, was doubtless owed to the social and familial obstacles women who wanted to pursue an academic career still face at this time. It also speaks to the nonchalance with which our radical critics of society now in subsequent decades continue to enjoy their patriarchal privileges. We may recall that Pollock and Horkheimer, as young adults, took it for granted that they would need to, quote, educate, end quote, their future wives. In this sense, it is no coincidence that the Institute's senior academic positions were held exclusively by men, even as women became increasingly emancipated. Not that this was in any way unusual in the German academy in the first half of the 20th century. Far from it, it was the norm. As the case of Hilda Weiss demonstrates, female academics certainly did feature in the Institute's work early on. Hilda Weiss came to the Institute in 1924 as a doctoral student working under Grunberg's supervision, left again following the completion of the doctorate, but returned in 1930 as Pollock's research assistant. It may be tempting to cite her example as evidence for the fact that the suitability of women for academic careers was never in doubt for Pollock and Pollock's colleagues. Alas, when Hilda Weiss later sought to rejoin the Institute in exile, she was rejected in no small measure on sexist grounds. In a letter to Horkheimer, Adorno pointed to her, as he saw it, unduly aggressive character. Pollock's no doubt well-meaning suggestion that Hilda Weiss might work as a nanny until she found a suitable position likewise throws a shocking light on the critical theoretician's concept of gender roles. The Institute was, from the outset, an essentially male domain. The Institute's 5-story building comprised 18 offices, seminar rooms, the library and its own stacks, and several guest rooms for doctoral students and fellows. For an independent research institute, these were unusually generous facilities. Compared to similar institutes, such as the Forschung Institute for Sozialwissenschaften, Research Institute for the Social Sciences, that had recently opened in Cologne, the Institute was also employed a significant number of permanent staff and associates. As we saw, Pollock was the general manager. Grunberg had arranged for his former mentee and close friend Henrik Grossman, who was facing serious political persecution in Poland and urgently needed to leave the country, to join the Institute. As a young activist, Grossman, who originally came from Krakow, had played a leading role in the Jewish Social Democratic Party of Galicia, ZPS. The ZPS was active in the part of Poland that came under Austrian control in the course of the Polish partitions and formed the counterpart to the better-known Bund, the General Jewish Labor Bund, which operated in the part of Poland under Russian control and in Russia itself. He subsequently acquired his postdoctoral qualification in Vienna, where Grunberg was his mentor. Returning to Poland in 1921, he joined the Communist Party. He was an expert on Marx's crisis theory, but ultimately a relatively conventional Marxist, and in his book, Das Accumulationstheorie, das Accumulations und Zusammenbruchsgesetz des kapitalistischen Systems, parenthesis, zugleich eine Christentheorie, and parenthesis, the law of accumulation and breakdown of the capitalist system, being also a theory of crises, and parenthesis, published in 1929 as the first volume in the Institute's book series, predicted the inevitable collapse of capitalism. In 1925, Karl August Wittfogel, parenthesis, who switched from the Independent Socialists to the KPD in 1920, and parenthesis, took up a permanent position at the Institute. Alongside his work for the Institute, he was also involved in the Marxist Workers' Academy, parenthesis, Marxistische Arbeiterschule, and parenthesis, established in Berlin in 1926 by Hermann Duncker, where Korsch also taught, and he co-edited its publication series jointly with Duncker and Alphonse Goldschmidt. In addition to this core staff, numerous doctoral and postdoctoral scholars were fully integrated into, and in some cases funded by, the Institute. 4 of these scholars merit closer attention, insofar as they became friends and colleagues who went on to play an important role in Pollock's life. Leo Löwenthal, Paul Massing, Kurt Mendelbaum, and Julian Gumpertz. Löwenthal, a secondary school teacher by training, joined the Institute in 1926 as a fellow working on Soziologie der deutschen Novelle im 19. Jahrhundert, parenthesis, sociology of the German novella in the 19th century, end parenthesis. Born in Frankfurt in 1900 to a Jewish family, parenthesis, his father was a physician, end parenthesis. He was initially a supporter of the labor Zionist cause. At the time, Löwenthal was closely associated with Ernst Simon, whose many connections in the Jewish community opened up various doors for him. Parenthesis, Simon went on to become a prominent Israeli educationalist. End parenthesis. At one point, Löwenthal worked for the Welfare Bureau for Eastern European Jewish refugees, and he occasionally gave lectures at Franz Rosenzweig's Free House of Jewish Learning. From early 1925 to early 1926, he and Simon co-edited the Frankfurt-based Orthodox weekly Jüdisches Wochenblatt. But it turned out that the periodical was unable to sustain 2 editors. In 1920, he met Erich Fromm and Siegfried Krakauer, both of whom were later associated with the Institute, among those who flocked to the charismatic rabbi Nehemias Anton Nobel. Krakauer, in turn, introduced him to his best friend, Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno, and the 3 of them became good friends. In 1925, Löwenthal's increasing disillusionment with Zionism led him to abandon the movement. Having completed his doctorate on Franz von Baader's philosophy of religion in 1923, Leo Löwenthal now focused primarily on his studies again and successfully applied to join the Institute. Paul Massing, whose father was a land registry administrator who was 2 years younger than Löwenthal and one of the few non-Jews to work for the Institute. Paul Massing initially conformed to Oppenheimer's description of the typical Frankfurt student. Following his graduation in economics, Paul Massing acquired a business diploma at the Commercial College in Cologne. Yet rather than go straight into the private sector, Massing went to Paris to study for a further year, and then in 1928 joined the Institute and completed his thesis on 19th century agronomy under the supervision of the economist Wilhelm Gerloff. Having become an orthodox Marxist in the meantime, he subsequently moved to Moscow to work at the International Agricultural Institute. He did not return to Germany until 1931, and then worked not for the Institute but for the Central Committee of the KPD in Berlin. Kurt Mandelbaum was born into a Jewish family in Schweinfurt in 1904. Kurt Mandelbaum's father, too, was a physician. He joined the Institute in 1927 on Korsch's recommendation. A member of the KPD since 1922, he was many of the, quote, ultra-left sectarians, end quote, expelled together with the likes of Heinz Langerhans, Werner Scholem, and Karl Korsch from the now staunchly Stalinist party in 1926. Mandelbaum read economics and philosophy in Würzburg, Munich, and Berlin. In 1926, Kurt Mandelbaum was one of the first scholars to complete his doctorate under Grünberg's supervision in Frankfurt, with a thesis on debates among German social democrats about imperialism. Die Erörterungen innerhalb der deutschen Sozialdemokratie über das Problem des Imperialismus. Parenthesis, 1895 to 1914, end parenthesis. When Pollock was promoted to deputy director of the institute the following year, he employed Mandelbaum as his assistant. Julian Gumpertz was the oldest of the doctoral students associated with the institute. Julian Gumpertz came from a family of German-American Jewish industrialists and was born in New York in 1898. Julian Gumpertz had come to Germany as a young adult and begun to study economics in Halle. Yet his attention soon shifted to the expressionist and Dadaistic cultural scene, and specifically to one of its journals, Der Gegner, parenthesis, the adversary, parenthesis, which he co-edited, first with Karl Otten, then with Wieland Herzfelde. In 1921, he published a selection of Karl Liebknecht's articles and speeches and joined the editorial team of the KPD's flagship periodical, Die Rote Fahne. He also became increasingly involved with the aforementioned Malik Publishing House, which was loosely associated with the party, and in 1923 brought out Georg Lukács's path-breaking Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, parenthesis, history and class consciousness, and parenthesis, a work of crucial significance for the interpretation of Marx. According to the memoirs of Hedda Massing, parenthesis, who was married to him from 1926 to 1933, and parenthesis, Gumpertz was asked in 1925, quote, to supervise all of the German Communist Party publishing, end quote, for the Communist International. Once an ardent supporter of the Soviet Union, Gumpertz had become increasingly disillusioned, however. Hedda Massing recalled that, quote, as part of his responsibility, he went fairly often to the Soviet Union, ... When he came back from those short trips, there was none of the glow of enthusiasm for Russia that I had seen in him after his first trip in 1923, ... He was coming to dislike it more and more. He did not tell me at the time what it was that so disappointed him, but he did quit the job very suddenly and without much explanation, end quote. In 1927, as the Stalinization of the Soviet Union gathered pace, Gumpertz stopped working for the party and abandoned Bolshevism altogether. Felix Weil started funding the Malik Publishing House in a big way in 1925. In conjunction with Weil's engagement, Pollock joined the publisher's supervisory board alongside the cultural studies scholar Edward Fuchs and Malik's founder Wieland Herzfelde. In this capacity, he worked closely with Gumpertz, whom he had already met and taken a shine to at the Marxist Study Week, when he was looking for a new professional opportunity following his departure from the communist movement. Pollock invited him to join the institute. Gumpertz accepted the invitation and became Pollock's closest collaborator. What Pollock could not know was that in 1928, Richard Zorga recruited Gumpertz's wife, Hedda, as a Soviet agent. Gumpertz's marriage soon broke down, and in 1929, his wife moved in with Paul Massing, who was also a Soviet spy. Footnote: her first husband was the KPD official Gerhard Eisler, who later chaired the East German National Broadcasting Committee. The composer Hans Eisler and Ruth Fischer, who stood at the helm of the KPD in 1924/25, were his siblings. End footnote. It seems remarkable that four, or if one includes Felix Weil's stint as an informer, 5 individuals involved with the Institute, Hedda Gumpertz, Paul Massing, Christiana Zorga and Richard Zorga were Soviet agents. The constellation speaks to the permeability of the dividing lines between the various factions of the Weimar left, and to the ambivalent feeling of many leftists vis-à-vis the Bolshevik regime. In this respect, Pollock and Horkheimer were no exception, although it is hard to imagine that either of them would have agreed to spy for the Soviet Union. Initial sympathies with the Soviet Union rapidly dissipated when Stalin managed to make himself the uncontested leader, and many were appalled by the Stalinization of the Communist parties elsewhere. Yet this was an incremental and by no means linear process. Many tried for the longest time to ignore, minimize, or rationalize the mounting terror. As early as 1922, Pollock and Horkheimer's friend from their time in Munich, Germaine Krul, had informed them of her unsettling experiences in the, quote, promised land of the workers, end quote, where she had been arrested as a, quote, spy and counter-revolutionary, end quote. Quote, you know, end quote, she wrote in a letter to them, quote, that I am a truthful person, so you can imagine that I did not turn into a vehement opponent of these people for petty personal reasons. It is now clear to me that it would be a misfortune for the world and the working class in particular if Bolshevism came to the West, end quote. Responding to her letter, Pollock and Horkheimer expressed their empathy for Krul, yet at the same time writing to his wife, Horkheimer drew the grounds from Krul's anti-Bolshevik turn into question. Quote, there are objections of principle against the social revolution which I respect, but I have always hated the notion of, quote, learning from experience, end quote, that emanates from her letter like the stench of putrefaction, and be it the experience of physical death, exclamation point, end quote. Madame Horkheimer may well have wondered what the, quote, objections of principle, end quote, her husband had in mind in the threat of being tortured to death, if the threat of being tortured to death did not count. One can only speculate that it was his frustration at the way the Soviet Union was developing that engendered this kind of cynicism. Yet Pollock and Horkheimer's critical solidarity increasingly turned into fundamental rejection, and eventually they became card-carrying anti-Bolsheviks. Committed to the original aspirations inherent in Marxist theory all the same, the Institute thus became a preferred refuge for those who turned their backs on Bolshevism. To be sure, the Institute's non-Jewish collaborators, Zorga, Wittfogel, and Massing, remained loyal to party communism for the time being, but the overwhelming majority of its mostly Jewish and associates turned away from the communist movement, capital C communist movement, in the course of the 1920s, shifted their attention to scholarly research on Marxism and the further development of Marxist theory. According to an internal report by Frankfurt's police chief of 1926, it had been, quote, demonstrated irrefutably that Professor Grunberg's former assistants at the Institute of Social Research, Dr. Friedrich Pollock and Dr. Felix Weil, and all the Institute's employees are communists, end quote. Capital C, of course. In Pollock's case, this was certainly not the whole truth. Like the communists, Pollock subscribed to Marx's critique of capitalism, but even in his doctoral thesis, he had not drawn out its revolutionary implications, and instead focused on its potential for the critique of ideology. And, personal contacts notwithstanding, Friedrich Pollock had certainly had no dealings with party communism, especially after Stalin's ascent in the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik purge of the KPD. If Pollock and his colleagues distanced themselves from the communist movement, they did so not on the understanding that they were changing their position, but that it was the movement that had mutated. The so-called Schlageter policy, adopted in 1923, committed the KPD to a nationalist agenda that was diametrically opposed to Marx's internationalism. The so-called Schlageter policy, adopted in 1923, committed the KPD to a nationalist agenda that was diametrically opposed to Marx's internationalism. Under Ernst Thälmann's leadership, the party became a Bolshevik outpost and anathematized councilists and other non-dogmatic Marxist or Trotskyite positions, and Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian society governed by terror and oppression. It took quite something to be sufficiently deluded on ideological grounds to ignore this development. As an episode that has hitherto drawn insufficient attention illustrates, this transformation also made itself clear in the Institute. Following the October Revolution, the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Russia decided to create an institute for the collection and preservation of the Marxist heritage and the production of both popular and scholarly editions of the writings of Marx and Engels. The Marx-Engels Institute (MEI) undoubtedly served propaganda purposes too, but the appointment of its first director indicated an ideological open-mindedness that would not have been that would have been inconceivable under Stalin. The appointment went to David Borisovich Ryazanov, a Jewish Marxist born in Odessa in 1870, who prior to the First World War had sympathized with the socialist revolutionary Narodniki before shifting his allegiance to the Marxist labor movement. I have Ryazanov's book on Introduction to Marx and Engels on the channel. Not all the videos have been made public yet, but they're all uploaded and ready to go, so they'll be coming out, if they're not already all up already by the time you're listening to this video. Ryazanov was chosen for the position because although its publication was ultimately prevented by the turmoil of the war, Ryazanov was well respected for his edition of the minutes and documents of the First International. Ryazanov had long wanted to publish an edition of the complete works of Marx and Engels, (mega), an endeavor that initially garnered enthusiastic support from the Bolshevik Central Committee. The principal challenge for Ryazanov lay in the fact that Marx's manuscripts and documents were dispersed across Europe and partly in private ownership. A significant part of the material was owned by the SPD archive and Karl Kautsky, whose relationship to the Russian communists was ambivalent at best. Ryazanov therefore needed an ally who could mediate between the MEI and the SPD. Given that Ryazanov and the exceedingly well-connected Grünberg had a long-standing working relationship, the Institute of Social Research seemed the ideal candidate for this role. I believe that also Ryazanov, I don't know what this would have mattered in terms of his relationship with Kautsky, but I believe Ryazanov was a Menshevik prior to the revolution. Given that Ryazanov and the exceedingly well-connected Grünberg had a long-standing working relationship, the Institute of Social Research seemed the ideal candidate for this role. On the 20th of August 1924, just after its inauguration, the Institute signed a cooperation agreement with the Marx-Engels Institute Publishing Company, Limited. It was run by Felix Weil and Friedrich Pollock. Ryazanov's former colleague, Boris Ivanovich Nikolevsky, who was a leading Menshevik, had left the Soviet Union in 1922 and was now based in Berlin, coordinated the inventorization, production of photographic copies, and collation of the material on behalf of the Moscow Institute, and became Pollock and Weil's principal point of contact. So maybe that's, a good, the Menshevik connection there. For several years, Pollock, Weil, and Nikolevsky joined in 1925 by Hans Jaeger, invested a great deal of energy into acquiring the documents and sending photocopies to Russia. Quote, the photostatic copying of the Marx-Engels papers, end quote, Weil later recalled, quote, also happened in the Institute with the approval of the SPD executive, end quote. A staff of 6 working in 2 shifts was tasked with copying the 150,000 pages in the Institute's basement. A courier then collected the copies and transported them to the Soviet embassy in Berlin. Quote, from there they went by diplomatic courier to the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. All the papers were copied in this way. The Marx-Engels Institute then prepared the volumes for publication by the Marx-Engels Archive publishing enterprise, which was initially based in Frankfurt, end quote. The first issue of the supplementary journal, Marx-Engels Archiv, came out in 1925, and the first part of the mega volume containing Werke und Schriften bis Anfang 1844, nebst Briefen und Dokumenten, parenthesis, works and writings up to early 1844, as well as letters and documents, end parenthesis, was published in 1927. The publication date was intentionally chosen to mark the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, celebrated in Moscow with much ado. On Ryazanov's recommendation, Pollock was invited to attend the official ceremony, which was quite a privilege. Pollock arrived in the capital of the, quote, workers' fatherland, end quote, on the 25th of October 1927 and stayed for an entire month. The MEI put him up in a hotel and let it be known that he should consider himself a guest of the Institute. On the 7th of November 1927, along with numerous other Western authors, cultural figures, and academics supportive of the Soviet cause, Pollock witnessed a huge parade organized by the regime on Red Square. The parade was followed by a march of 600,000 workers sporting banners, pennants, and flags. Reflecting on this event, the expressionist poet Armin T. Wegener resorted to religious metaphors, characterizing it as a pilgrimage to the Red Jerusalem. End quote. The author, Josef Roth, had attended the official May Day rally in Moscow the year before. Even though he hardly sympathized with the Bolsheviks, he penned an enthusiastic report, quote, "This march past is the forceful military spectacle of our age and likely since Napoleon. Repeated so many times, it loses none of its force and is always fresh," end quote. Yet unlike many other Western Marxist intellectuals, Pollock was no mere political tourist. Inspired by Felix Weil's research on socialization, Pollock had developed an interest in problems pertaining to the planned economy and decided to study the Soviet economic order. Pollock's stay in Moscow offered him the rare opportunity to observe institutions involved in the planning process at close quarters, consult practitioners, and gather a wealth of relevant source material. He took copious notes on everything he heard and observed, and amassed a substantial collection of pamphlets, directives, internal memoranda, flyers, scholarly publications, and economic plans. The Marx-Engels Institute, and Ryazanov in particular, made every effort to support his research and opened quite a few doors for him that would otherwise presumably have remained closed. What Pollock had observed was a serious and sincere attempt to graft a planned industrial economy onto the semi-feudal relations of production in a country significantly lagging behind technologically and characterized by mass poverty and recurring famines. It's important that this would be, if you just don't know what year he said, this is 1927. This would have been before, like, the first 5-year plan. Where am I at? Anyway, could this endeavor succeed? How did the dictatorship of the Communist Party impact the small leaseholders and farm laborers who still form the majority of the population? What might one learn in the West from the Soviet project? When Pollock left Moscow, he had not yet reached a judgment. The letter he wrote to Ryazanov following his return to Frankfurt to thank him for his support during his stay in Moscow clearly indicated that he had gone to the Soviet Union not to indulge romantic notions regarding the revolution or the workers, but to undertake research. Quote, "Having arrived in Frankfurt safe and sound," end quote, he wrote, "I would like to assure you and your wife of my sincere gratitude for your warm welcome and emphatic support in Moscow. Without your help, I would surely have been unable to gain such a thorough overview over the evolving Soviet economy in the few weeks I was able to spend in Moscow," end quote. Pollock had finally identified a suitable topic for his postdoctoral thesis that would allow him to be appointed to a chair, and he did not intend to waste any time. Grunberg enthusiastically welcomed the prospect of a rigorous analysis of the Soviet planned economy. He suggested Karl Emanuel Pribram, a Jewish economist who originally came from Prague and had recently taken up a position in Frankfurt, a second supervisor, and Pribram agreed. Bursting with energy, Pollock began to work on an outline analyzing the statistical data and primary source material and familiarizing himself with the relevant secondary literature. Walter Behan, an associate of the Institute with Trotskyite leanings, assisted him, and the Odessa-born student Rudolf Zelka, who had also recently been expelled from the KPD as a Trotskyite, helped with the translation. Numerous Soviet officials whom Pollock had met in Moscow sent him additional material and were happy to answer his queries. Pollock took care to maintain his contact to Soviet officials and economists, and they repeatedly shared valuable information with him that was not readily available in Germany. In November 1928, Roman Efimovich Freiburg, who worked for the Soviet Planning Authority, sent a copy of his recently published book on problems connected to the prognostics involved in drawing up the 5-year plan to, quote, "My dear comrade Pollock, with best wishes," end quote. The following year, R.N.L. Geister, the deputy head of the State Planning Commission, forwarded a copy of his book on the collectivization of Soviet agriculture to, quote, "Comrade Dr. Pollock," and spelled wrong, P-O-L-L-A-K, end quote. Consequently, Pollock was able to draw on an extraordinarily rich source base for his postdoctoral thesis, a work that is still of interest to Soviet historians. In March 1929, it was published as the second volume in the Institute's book series, Die planwirtschaftlichen Versuche in der Sowjetunion, 1917 to 1927, parenthesis, the attempts to construct a planned economy in the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1927, and parenthesis. As Pollock emphasized in the introduction, his was the first, quote, his was the, quote, first attempt by a non-Bolshevik party to offer at least a general economic history of Russia in the last 10 years, end quote. Contrary to the claims of the Bolsheviks' opponents, economic policy was, quote, discussed controversially and with the greatest openness both in Soviet literature and at party congresses and conferences, end quote. Consequently, the records of these debates provided excellent source material. Conversely, he had not studied the publications of the Communist International, given the extent to which they bore the, quote, imprint of political propaganda, end quote. On Pollock's account, Soviet economic policy was experimental in nature. It was driven by clearly identifiable concepts taken from the writings of Marx and Engels, and especially Lenin, but their implementation was anything but straightforward. How far Russia lagged behind in its industrial development, a phase of transition was clearly required to move from a still largely feudal system to communism, capital C communism. Pollock distinguished two phases in the development towards communism, capital C, to date. In the initial phase of war communism, parenthesis, from 1917 to 1921, economic policy had been dictated by the hardship caused by the First World War and then by the Civil War. The party could hardly be held responsible for the catastrophic supply and hunger crisis of these years, given that it resulted from global political and economic circumstances. Yet Pollock took issue with the fact that leading Bolsheviks had sought to make a virtue of necessity and presented war communism as the shortest path to socialism. The elimination of the market without putting in its place a carefully thought-out and well-functioning administration could not but lead to a catastrophe. Quote, when the peasant's grain is requisitioned without any substantial compensation, and the village consequently returns to the most primitive form of closed household economy, when the feudal corvée is resurrected to compel labor for the purposes of timber procurement, then industry is administered to death. When industry is administered to death, and the entire economy eventually grinds to a halt, end quote, Pollock concluded. It was hard to see in all of this, quote, a kind of economy superior to the exchange of economy, End quote. Lenin had recognized this and in 1921 introduced what was then still the current phase in the development towards communism, the New Economic Policy, NEP. The New Economic Policy facilitated the partial reintroduction of market-based commerce and easing of the supply crisis and a carefully bounded measure of social liberalization. For Pollock, it was this policy that marked the genuine shift towards a planned economy. This may seem like a paradoxical contention, given the legalization of private commerce the new policy entailed. Yet Pollock interpreted it against the backdrop of Lenin's concept of state capitalism as the transitional stage that would prepare the way for communism. On a pragmatic level, the reintroduction of private commerce was designed to ease the supply crisis, but the new policy was also meant to integrate private commerce into the planned economy and subvert private commerce to the plan. This form of state capitalism was a considerable improvement over the false radicalism of war communism, which had depressed living standards. Crucially, however, the politically dictated and scientifically implemented economic plan would also take precedence, while allowing, say, peasants who produced more than the plan required to sell the surplus privately. This fostered productivity and offered peasants a practical means of making a better living for themselves. It was important to acknowledge that the contentment of the population was a central concern for communism. Substantial landowners, kulaks, on the other hand, who were held responsible for the misery created by the feudal system and on whom the Bolsheviks had declared war, would continue to be constrained in their economic activities. Pollock could hardly be expected to anticipate that Stalin would have large numbers of actual or ostensible opponents identified as kulaks murdered some years later. Conversely, in light of his positive reception of the new economic policy, it is obvious that he could interpret Stalin's policies in the years 1828 to 1933 only as a return to the false radicalism of war communism. It should be noted that Pollock was far more interested in the technical than the political aspects of his topic. Pollock wanted to know whether and how a planned economy worked and what pitfalls needed to be avoided if one were to introduce it, say, in Germany. The crash of 1929 was not far off, and anyone who paid close attention could sense that capitalism was on the verge of a fundamental crisis. As we saw while Pollock was writing his postdoctoral thesis, Pollock's colleague Henrik Grossman was working on The Law of Accumulation, also published in 1929. For all his criticism of Grossman's book, Pollock did share his colleague's assumption that capitalism was unavoidably heading for a substantial crisis. On Grossman's account, this crisis would need to coincide with a major imperialist war that would lead to the massive destruction of goods and infrastructure, which in turn would rewind the accumulation clock. Whatever one may make of the way in which Grossman deployed his evidence in detail, his acuity in predicting the imminent Great Depression and Second World War was certainly remarkable. Pollock shared his colleagues' fears, but assumed that war and destruction might yet be averted if the mounting crisis engendered the insight that a planned economy was superior to the market economy. As he saw it, the future belonged to the planned economy, and one needed to be intimately familiar with its workings. The opportunities it offered and the problems it raised. This explains Pollock's generally sympathetic evaluation of the Soviet planned economy, various individual criticisms notwithstanding. One of the contemporaneous reviewers was spot on when he suggested that Pollock's, quote, charitable approach to socialist construction, end quote, resembled the, quote, inquisitiveness of an observer who displayed a great deal of interest in the Soviet experimentation, but ultimately remains a skeptic, end quote. Pollock was particularly concerned that the planning method was insufficiently evidence-based. Pollock also criticized the excessive bureaucratization and attendant corruption. Pollock also raised a number of more general issues resulting from the pioneering nature of the Bolshevik experiment. Yet, quote, all these transitional challenges, end quote, were dwarfed, quote, by the fact that the attempt is being made to establish socialism in an agrarian country, whether socialism can be established rather than on an international scale, merely in one country, is already a moot point. In an agrarian country, however, several crucial prerequisites are definitely missing, end quote. All his sympathies and principle notwithstanding, Pollock ultimately questioned the very possibility of establishing socialism in Russia then. From the vantage point of the Communist Party, this was an extraordinary provocation. Meanwhile, rather fittingly, the cooperation between the Institute of Social Research and the Marx Engels Institute was drawing to a close. Quote, "Dear Comrade Ryazanov!" exclamation point, end quote. Pollock wrote in a letter dated 16th of July, 1928, perhaps, quote, "you will consider whether Comrade Zobel, bracket, the deputy director of the Marx Engels Institute, end bracket, might come here on or after the 10th of August so we can discuss all the issues concerning the dissolution of our, quote, marriage, end quote, in detail, end quote." Both parties had reasons for wanting to terminate the cooperation. Having obtained copies of most of Marx and Engels' papers, Moscow wanted to take full control of the Mega. The Institute in Frankfurt, on the other hand, under pressure for supposedly being too close to Moscow, we may recall the internal report by Frankfurt's police chief in 1926, was not at all unhappy to cap its actual connections with the Marx-Engels Institute. Relations were further complicated by the fact that Grünberg suffered a massive stroke in January 1928, leaving Pollock to run the Institute's affairs as acting director. The termination of the cooperation agreement coincided with the domestic transformation of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party viewed the Mega, the close relations to Democrats such as Edward Bernstein, the work on the edition entailed, and Ryazanov himself, with increasing suspicion. In 1930, the MEI was purged. 131 of its 243 employees were dismissed. On the 15th of February 1931, Ryazanov was arrested, accused of being involved in a Menshevik conspiracy and exiled to Saratov. Ryazanov was initially able to continue with his scholarly work, but the Great Terror eventually caught up with him. Re-elected in July 1937, he resolutely refused to confess any crimes or implicate anyone else. Ryazanov was executed in January 1938. The Mega, of which only a handful of volumes had been published, was aborted. At this point, the Institute's Marxist period, in the narrower sense of the word, ended. Grünberg's stroke had left him severely incapacitated, and Pollock, who was now in charge of the Institute, paved the way for Grünberg's replacement by a close associate, Pollock's friend and housemate, Max Horkheimer. To be sure, Pollock continued to draw on Marxian concepts for the rest of his life, but the critical distance he had put between himself and the Orthodox Party communism of the Communist Party of Germany was a crucial prerequisite for the subsequent development of an undogmatic, critical social theory. That's the end of Chapter 4. Thank you for listening.